Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here at the New York Academy of Sciences Anthropology section. This is our first in-person event in a very, very long time. And we welcome our digital audience as well. Hello out there in Cyberland. Thank you for joining us all for this wonderful conversation between Professor Monica Heller and Angela Reyes from here in New York. I'd like to just take a moment to introduce the series, and then Danilyn Rutherford of Wennergren will introduce the speakers. The 2022-23 series has a theme of crisis, and the subtitle is Past Upheavals, Current Conjectures, and the Future Forward. This distinguished lecture series for the academic year 2022-23 explores how anthropology illuminates our understandings of and engagements with contemporary crises. Welcoming scholars from the four fields of anthropology, we address the notion that crisis may always have been a common shared human experience, suggesting that anthropology can shed light on the way people have understood and resolved, well, I'm not used to presenting anymore, resolved past and present crises, analyses that might help us find a way forward. Sometimes change occurs incrementally, allowing strong continuities to reinforce age-old patterns. Other times, transformation arrives abruptly, bringing disruption and destruction, as well as opportunities for resilience and rebuilding in the aftermath of crisis. How have humans sought to move forward from crisis, finding, despite the rubble, opportunities to rebuild structures of society, polity, health, and well-being? Our 2022-23 Distinguished Lecture Series builds on the work of our recently deceased and distinguished colleague, Dr. Paul Farmer, who stated, "The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that's wrong with the world." We invite speakers and our global audience to contemplate his words and use anthropological theory, research, and perspectives to examine what factors contribute to the contemporary confluence of crises and to propose paths forward to achieve a more just, equitable, and sustainable future. So we're in this moment of coming back together again, which I just realized as I stumble on presenting, which is our bread and butter, talking in front of an audience about the things we love. We have new kinds of disturbances even as we come back together. And so we're really delighted that you are here with us in person, taking what risks you took to travel, to Professor Heller and her family for coming to be with us, for all of you who braved the subways and the traffic and the drizzly night in New York City, to be with us in person. And it's really meaningful that we are here together in solidarity with each other. And at the same time, it's a really interesting experience to know that there's solidarity in a world that's beyond this room, in a world we can't see. So we have sort of the disturbance of coming out of the pandemic, which is a disturbance I wasn't anticipating, feeling disturbed by, but it's kind of unsettling in some ways. But also then the resilience of coming back together again as a community of scholars and friends and colleagues. And for that, we are very grateful. So let me introduce Danilyn Rutherford, or bring Danilyn Rutherford up. She's the president of the Wennergren Foundation, and she will introduce our speakers tonight.
Great. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have this task. We were so delighted when tonight's distinguished lecturer agreed to present in person, and equally delighted when her discussant agreed to be here too. As Stephanie just said, this is the first time we've been together in a very long time, and I can think of no better people to kick us off into whatever this strange new era is going to be. Dr. Monica Heller is Professor Emerita at the University of Toronto, where she was affiliated with the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and the Department of Anthropology. She received her bachelor's degree from Swarthmore College and her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in linguistics, and then went on to do what can only be described as path-breaking work. Her work on ideologies of practice and nation in Francophone Canada has shed light on the role of language in the making and unmaking of social difference and social inequality. It's been the basis of countless articles and at least 10 books and edited volumes. I had to look on the internet, so there may be some others out there, in both English and French. The titles give you a sense of just how important this work has been to our field and the public conversation, and I can think of at least one NPR podcast, right, which talks about a keyword in one of her books, from code switching, anthropological and sociolinguistic perspectives, published in 1988, to Crosswords, Contributions to the Sociology of Language in 1994, and Linguistic Minorities and Modernity, a Sociolinguistic Ethnography in 2006, to finally, most recently, Language, Colonialism, and Capitalism, a Critical History in 2017. But it's not just her scholarship that's significant when it comes to what she's contributed to the field. It's also her service to the broader community of anthropologists. She's a past president of the American Anthropological Association, one of the first based in an institution outside of the United States. She's the incoming president of the Canadian Anthropological Society, and she's past editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sociolinguistics. She's also a member of the Royal Academy of Canada. I'd also like to welcome back to this series Dr. Heller's discussant, Dr. Angela Reyes, professor and chair of the Department of English at Hunter College. She's also doctoral faculty in the program in anthropology at the CUNY Graduate Center. She's also on the faculty advisory board member of the Asian American Studies program and the Mellon Mays undergraduate fellowship program at Hunter College. Dr. Reyes is no slouch herself. She received her doctorate in educational linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania and is the author or co-author of 6 books and edited volumes, From Relationality, Discursive Constructions of Asian Pacific American Identities in 2004, to Language, Identity, and Stereotype Among Southeast Asian Youth, The Other Asian in 2007, to Discourse Analysis Beyond the Speech Event, which was just been reissued and which won the Edward Sapir Prize from the Society for Linguistic Anthropology in 2016, and that's just one of her many, many honors. Dr. Reyes has done research in settings ranging from an Asian American Community Arts Center in Philadelphia to an Asian American cram school in New York to a private university in Manila. And she's just beginning a new project on Riot Girl punk feminist Zine archives from the early 1990s, which sounds pretty exciting too. Dr. Reyes's work sheds light on historical and contemporary forms of language and personhood, and as offers us new ways of theorizing the intersections between semiotics, racialization, and coloniality. And she's really the perfect interlocutor for Dr. Heller, so we're really thrilled that she's here to join us too. Dr. Heller's lecture is entitled, Things Don't Mean What They Used to, Crisis on the Terrain of Language. Please join me in welcoming both of our distinguished speakers.
Thank you so much for inviting me. You did give me the choice between doing this on Zoom or coming, and I'm like, I'm going to go. Haven't done that in a while. So thanks to all of you who have come out to join us. We'll have a nice conversation, I hope, and thank you to everybody who is here in some form, and I hope we'll get to hear from all of you too. So, Victor Klemperer, a German Romance philologist, was named professor at the Technische Universität Dresden in 1920. He kept a diary, making frequent entries through the years from the time he started in 1899, when he was 16 years old. Albeit a specialist in 18th and 19th century French literature, as a philologist, he was closely attentive to detailed features of language, not only in the French literature he studied, but also in the German of his daily life. In 1933, this déformation professionnelle, as we call it, I can explain it later, led him to begin systematically noting the ways in which he heard and read German being used in new, unfamiliar, and given the times, unsettling ways. A selection of his notes was published first in the German Democratic Republic in 1947 as Lingua Tertii Imperii, I'm not sure my Latin accent is okay, Notizbuch eines Philologen, language of the Third Reich, notebook of a philologist, and note the first part of the title in Latin, and then the switch to German for the second part, code switching. However, the West was largely ignorant of this work until the full notebooks covering the years 1933 to 1945 were published starting in 1991 and then widely translated. And this is where I need to find, I'm supposed to be able to switch on this. Oh, the clicker. clickers, fancy. So this is Victor Klemperer, and these are some of the features we'll talk about now. So Klemperer recorded a number of types of shifts that disturbed him. One was the appropriation and shift in valence of words that were already in regular use. The canonical example is perhaps his attention to the word fanatic, which he demonstrated was being used in a positive way to value strong, focused, and unquestioning commitment to an idea. Another was to use particularly ideologically charged words to modify other key ones. Here, the clearest example is perhaps the word folk to modify nouns like festival or community, or adverbs like near. He also noted a rise in frequency of acronyms. One example he gives is KNIF, kommt nicht zu fragen, it doesn't get called into question. Both Klemperer, and much later and retrospectively Christopher Hutton, also noted discursive efforts to define and delimit who could engage in such linguistic practice, that is, who had the right to rework how it would be considered proper and valuable to speak and write, and indeed, who had the right to speak and write at all. For example, Hutton notes a key passage in Hitler's Mein Kampf, which distinguished between languages understood as mother tongues, and which by definition, according to Hitler, spoke the truth, and others, like the constructed international auxiliary language Esperanto, which were necessarily, according to him, vehicles for lies. Similarly, people could speak the truth only in their mother tongue, so everybody had to have one. But people who were constructed as having no mother tongue, like Jews, were understood to be unable to speak the truth, even if they were speaking in a mother tongue language like German. As a result, of course, Jews could not really be German either. Dorinda Outram, in a work she published a couple of decades ago, noted similar phenomena at another time of crisis, the French Revolution. In this case, revolutionaries delegitimated the monarchy and aristocracy as decadent, their word, as evidenced by their terms, flowery language and their verbosity, both of which were also understood as signs of the undue influence of women. A true revolutionary needed to speak le langage mâle de la vertu, the male language of virtue, with vertu understood as the opposite of decadence. This masculine language, like that of the Nazis, had to be direct, brief, and strong, and it could only legitimately be valued as such if uttered or written by a man. Women and the aristocracy could not, by virtue of their embodied social positions, speak in the new way the revolutionaries were using to advance their strategies of violent disruption and to link their political cause to specific new forms of social and moral order. If I raise these examples, it's to introduce a few reflections on what language has to do with crisis. The first is to note the unsettling feeling that taken for granted ways of using language are called into question. Things don't mean what they used to. Or to use a concept from Pierre Bourdieu, what counts as legitimate language is destabilized. To take Bourdieu's formulations further, the same is true of who can count as a legitimate speaker or hearer, or what can count as a legitimate discursive space. One example, here she is, Manon Roland, the intellectually influential wife of the Parisian revolutionary Jean-Marie Roland, could only exercise her influence through her husband. She could hold a salon, but she could do no more than listen to the discussion while she knitted. Another, a bit closer to home, no picture for this one, my German-born Jewish mother recalls that in 1933, it took only 3 weeks for her schoolmates to go from ridiculing the radio broadcast speeches they were forced to listen to, standing up at attention in the gymnasium, to taking them as fully authoritative, and therefore to accepting as necessary the exclusion of my mother and her siblings, first from birthday parties, then from the school, and then from Germany, and then, for those who had not found a way out, as my mother's family did, from life. Of course, at the same time, in both these places and both these periods, there were other discourses circulating and emerging which competed for authority in the service of remaking the world that had come apart. For Europe, in the period after World War I, we can point notably to a variety of egalitarian movements, some oriented to liberal democracy and others to communism and anarchism. Language was equally important to these movements in a variety of forms. One was the popularity of invented auxiliary languages, invented international auxiliary languages, IALs, the best known of which is certainly the aforementioned Esperanto. These languages were meant to be nobody's mother tongue, although people did experiment in that direction. They were meant to be really simple. Esperanto famously has 12 rules, therefore really easy for anybody to learn, and therefore something that would level the playing field among speakers of different mother tongues, different standard languages, and make it easier to understand each other, and therefore to avoid conflict as well as to carry out trade, which was also important at that time. So in these IALs were invested hopes of achieving mutual understanding, world peace, and for some, radical redistribution of wealth. Indeed, the Nazis sought to violently suppress Esperanto. They found it so threatening. And eventually, having once looked to Esperanto for international socialism, the USSR suppressed it once it had turned instead to Russification. Different approaches to this kind of problem included deep attention to translation among national standard languages. Translation as an academic discipline really dates from this period, or to orthographic and grammatical simplification in order to facilitate access to standard languages. So we get the basic English movement as a kind of calque in some sense on Esperanto. Let's try to reduce the number of rules and therefore make it easier for people to use it. At the same time, we find a rise in competing claims precisely to nation-state type language standardization in order to gain some control of regional markets that had been subsumed under empire. So the late 19th century and the immediate post-World War I period are moments of jockeying for position over who gets to have a standard language and therefore the control over the market that comes with it. So in that sense, that's the invention of so-called minority language movements, giving rise also to endless debates about the difference between dialects and languages, which we still happily engage in today. But we can also point, or unhappily as the case may be, but we can also point to more everyday practices, such as the opening up of discursive spaces, especially to women, for democratic deliberation, for the de-hierarchization of address terms, think use of comrade, and efforts at establishing turn-taking rules that would allow greater numbers of people to participate in a political discussion. The Occupy movement is a more recent example of efforts in this direction, and we'll return to Occupy later. Klemperer believed that one could scientifically identify what he called toxic language, that he said poisoned how people think. I don't agree that things are that simple, partly because I don't think language influence is sought in such a direct way, but also because I believe that crisis is not just about some people deciding they want to change the rules of the game in order to gain advantage. Rather, I think it's about the failure of a particular social order to deliver on what it promises. Most centrally, at least, to deliver some kind of hope for access to resources, be they material or symbolic. Under those conditions, and it's in the nature of capitalism, I think, to cyclically produce unsustainable gaps in wealth, legitimating discourses of existing relations of power lose authority or credibility. We no longer know what counts as something to be believed, or who counts as someone to be trusted. The result is that there are openings for competing discourses, and their concoctors and proponents must struggle to establish their authority and their credibility. That's a matter of language used not only institutionally, that is to say, harnessing the control over discursive space that religious institutions and states generally have, but also, as Klemperer and Outram pointed out, it's a matter of interaction in everyday life. So for instance, you could imagine that on the one hand, someone ridicules someone else's flowery language or their inability to use the term fanatic properly. And on the other hand, maybe someone celebrates and disseminates an inventive sharp acronym or delivers a particularly morally correct, impassioned speech to those gathered at the salon or in the school gymnasia of the country. The second question has to do with the link between linguistic forms and practices and the moral values underlying particular regimes of truth. This is what these days we would call language ideologies. I'm looking at my colleagues in the room here. The things that shape our recognition say that fascism, fanaticism, monologues, loudness, the radio, and acronyms go together, and that establish over large populations the authority of particular actors to act in particular ways and to get others to do the same. We need to explain why and how these get linked, and how they get inflected in ways which use all kinds of social categorizations, so usually class, race, gender, and sexuality, in the making of social differences, in turn, in the service of making or resisting the inequalities that crises of capitalism are all about. I think we can see echoes of these earlier assemblages in the crisis we're traversing today. Locutions such as fake news or wokeness evoke a destabilization of our frames of reference, and these are just examples that are close at hand and in English. We're having a hard time figuring out how to tell who is who. In Canada these days there's a huge debate over the notion of who is Indigenous, with the term pretendian figuring very importantly in those debates. So we're having a hard time figuring out how to tell who is who and whom to believe about what's going on, let alone what to do about it. So how does this relate to increasing wealth gaps and the climate crisis, which are both, in my view, the interrelated key features of the contemporary crisis of capitalism? Let's start with the legitimating discourses of the institutions which have held together the contradiction of capitalism, by which I mean its reliance on inequality versus its promises of universal access to the wealth that it generates. A key feature of modernity has been the relative success of the secular state in wresting control of doing this, reconciliation, some might call it mystification or masking, from religious authorities, but obviously not everywhere and not always. So I think we've inherited an uneasy alliance, closer in some places than others, between state and religious institutions, or spiritual ones, over what constitutes the moral order and who is responsible for delivering what in the way of access to resources. Uneasy alliances always leave interstices for promoting and resisting alternative discourses. We can perhaps understand this as a tension between Enlightenment modes of understanding, anchored in rationality and technological approaches to living, and romantic ones, which insist instead on nature and affect. The key institutions of the state, such as education, healthcare, the legal system, and the media, have largely been able to play dominant roles in constructing what counts as citizenship and who counts as citizens, with a greater emphasis on Enlightenment modes of discourse and less attention to romantic ones. Constructing state authority over citizenship, understood as legitimate claims to participation in the discursive spaces of the state and access to the resources it helps distribute, is, as I've tried to argue, centrally a communicative matter. First, you set up the spaces where regimes of truth are produced and reproduced. Then you set up criteria and processes of exclusion and inclusion, which are inherently connected in a substantive way to the regimes of truth being constructed. And then you double down on teaching people how to perform membership. Although, as Bourdieu pointed out, in many ways, you already have to know how to provide these performances in order to have access to and be admitted to these spaces in the first place. But these are also spaces of distribution of resources, whether material or symbolic. And of course, these are interchangeable. You can't get a job easily without an education or hold one down without your health. For things to remain stable, we have to believe that participation in these spaces, acting in the ways these spaces expect us to act, will facilitate our access to wealth generated by whatever economic processes produce it. So part of the destabilization we're experiencing is manifested in lack of trust that this contract can hold, and in refusals to play the game by heretofore routinely accepted rules. The idea of fake news attacks the media as authoritative source of accounts of what's going on, and delegitimates its modes of reporting as constructions of authoritative accounts. The idea of wokeness attacks higher education in the same way. Fights over the nature of principles of social organization, over the nature or even the existence of social differences and social inequality, such as race, gender, and class, reveal major cracks in discursive procedures for establishing shared frames of reference. Such shared frames are necessary for the most basic kinds of social and political relations, from agreeing on what it is we're fighting about to finding a way to do something about the conflict that might avert physical violence in its most extreme forms. At the same time, the contemporary world is full of efforts to think and do otherwise, many of them, of course, drawing on long-standing discourses from anarchism to science fiction. I referred earlier in passing to one example, the Occupy movement, and its deliberate attention to the vexed matter of turn-taking. Turn-taking, the question of who gets to speak when in a conversation with more than one participant, because otherwise it's a monologue, not a conversation, has been a focus of work in interactionist sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology and in ethnomethodological sociology for at least 50 years. The question is, how do we even know how to do this interaction thing? And what difference does it make to do it in one way or some other way? From an ethnomethodological perspective, this is one way to understand membership. Interaction can only happen if we use the same or at least similar rules. That allows us both to signal that we're on the same planet and to together reproduce that planet, build a new version of it, or build a new one altogether. For an experiment, you can try to test this out, is to refuse to say anything the next time you answer the phone. The conversation can't even happen, right? So what's the vision? Much work in this field has been devoted to showing that controlling turns at talk allows people with an interest in preserving their position of power to do so. It's a fundamental technique for the exercise of power. If you can't even say something, there's not much chance of being able to influence the outcome of an interaction. One can see being shouted over as an interactional equivalent of being censored. So one vision is potentially the reproduction of existing relations of inequality. In its attempt to challenge those, Occupy took seriously the problem of voice by trying to ensure that no one could control turn-taking. The movement instituted alternative rules for taking the floor and getting heard that corresponded better to their idea of horizontal democracy. Anyone can take the floor, and word gets passed to all the people present, literally by word of mouth. I have to listen to you because I have to repeat what you say. This is one way language is being harnessed to produce a world otherwise. Another example is the renewed interest in problems of global communication in the forms of promotion of such concepts as world Englishes, in renewed interest in Esperanto and other constructed languages, as well as in computer-facilitated translation and in artificial intelligence. In an echo of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the expansion of capitalism that we've called globalization, and the neoliberal policies states have adopted to facilitate it, has led to anxieties about who will control the global communications required to make that process work. In particular, these anxieties focus on the global spread of English and on the ability of the so-called native speaker, a racialized white from the heart of British and American empire, to define what counts as English and who counts as a legitimate speaker of it, and to control and profit from the global English language teaching industry. I should maybe comment in passing that Canadian Anglophones are particularly popular in this industry because we're somehow both British and American at the same time. There have been a number of responses to this issue. One has been to stake a claim for English to what the Corsican sociolinguist Jean-Baptiste Marcellesi called polynomism. He claimed this for Corsican, that is, to admit multiple centers of norm construction. And for English, this goes often under the heading World Englishes, following terminology introduced by Braj Katru. Another is to promote and celebrate multilingualism, which occurs in a wide range of ways, ranging from the European Union investment in standard language multilingualism, standard state language multilingualism, to the strengthening of so-called minority language movements, or the revitalization of languages, especially indigenous ones, thought to be no longer speakable or at all writable. Still another has been a return to Esperanto as an international auxiliary language meant to be easy to learn, as I said earlier, and so more democratically accessible than standard languages associated with specific nation states, some of which have endowed themselves, French, I'm thinking of you, with particularly complicated grammars and rules around vocabulary that precisely make them difficult to learn. Some adherents orient to Esperanto's pacifist and anti-nationalist genealogy. Some enter Esperanto through the free software movement, interested in what it can do to facilitate democratic access to and free circulation of information, and to the tools to create online discursive spaces out of the reach of corporations. Or they enter as self-styled geeks, interested in the technical capacities of constructed languages and in their ability to facilitate transnational connections. Still another response is to ramp up on the use of computers to facilitate rapid translation and interpretation in a tradition unfolding from investments in the Second World War and in the Cold War in so-called machine translation. Here the interest is in ensuring that humans don't mess up in ways that could inadvertently trigger a nuclear war. It's an interest in facilitating spying by getting around the onerous and expensive process of human language learning, and in avoiding putting too much trust in human multilinguals who can too easily betray masters who don't share their multilingualism. You may have heard the Italian expression traduttore traditore. In this view, technology is neutral, although I would say that that conveniently brackets the humans who build and run it. But it helps us understand the general interest in phenomena like artificial intelligence, which are forms of imagined ways out of this crisis. Finally, we need to turn to reimaginings of this world and imaginings of alternative ones. In recent years, we've seen the emergence of posthumanism, an effort to resolve the current crisis by moving past the Anthropocene. In this imagining, sociolinguists and linguistic anthropologists broaden their analyses of interaction to include humans interacting with animals, or with machines, or animals, or rocks and machines. But in the same line of thinking, trees communicate amongst each other. Then we have the world of science fiction, a genre which has been quite popular in times of crisis, including this one. Hollywood has produced a number of utopian and dystopian science fiction television shows and movies in which fully formed constructed languages, from Klingon to Dothraki to Na'vi, allow us to enter alternative worlds. Indeed, there's an entire, mainly online world of language constructing in which participants share tips and sometimes compete to cook up either particularly elegantly simple or particularly interesting languages in ways which both overlap with the renewal of interest in Esperanto and which are highly reminiscent of the frenzied production of international auxiliary languages between about 1890 and World War I. By definition, as Guilherme Fiennes points out, this shared activity in the discursive space of the internet, I'm talking to you people out there, creates community by requiring the negotiation of rules of engagement, what to talk about, how to talk about it, with whom to talk. However, all these emergent spaces most certainly have their boundaries, and therefore their forms of policing. And so however alternative they may be, or they may aim to be, often, ironically, they reproduce at least some of the hierarchies they're meant to subvert or transform. That's not the main point I want to make. Instead, I hope you take away with you the fact that language plays an important role as a terrain of struggle, and that it can be used to foment crisis as often as it is used to construct a means of navigating and resolving it. It's in language, broadly understood, that we make and unmake how we understand and organize our world. And so it's a central arena for making both conflict and solidarity when what the world is supposed to do and what it actually delivers get unstuck. What's at stake is nothing less than our understanding of how the world works or should work, and therefore of who belongs and who doesn't, of what you have to do in order to belong, and of who or what merits life and who or what does not. Thank you. So I don't know if you want to leave Klingon.
Hi, good evening, everybody. It is an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with Monica and all of you tonight here and online. Thank you to Danilyn Rutherford, Stephanie Rupp, Baird Campbell for organizing this event and for the kind invitation to serve as discussant for Monica, who was brilliant and provocative as always. I'm going to keep my comments short so we have plenty of time for discussion. I will just say a few words and end with a couple questions Monica's talk left me contemplating. So Monica is asking us to think about crisis and the role of language, how crises are mediated by linguistic processes, how crises cause us to question what legitimate speech is, who legitimate speakers are, what legitimate discursive places are, and how crises are managed by linguistic solutions. Are we in a crisis now? And what is it? Monica argues that we are in a crisis of capitalism that has produced increasing wealth gaps and the climate crisis. So crises within crises within crises. But what is crisis? For Monica, quote, crisis is not simply about some people deciding they want to change the rules of the game in order to gain advantage, but rather it is about the failure of a particular social order to deliver on what it promises, end quote. What I like about this phrasing is that it points to how useless or even dangerous it is to think of crisis as a coercive top-down process, as if power is composed of only rational actors with well-formed plans for engineering the world to their benefit. To view crisis through this unproductive lens would have us reduce crisis to a moral battle between good guys and bad guys. If crisis is the failure of a particular social order to deliver on what it promises, I would just add that it is not failure itself, but the recognition of failure. And this is where linguistic anthropology becomes incredibly important. Our orientation enables us to interrogate the ideological and semiotic processes that make the social order appear as failure. In other words, it's not that failure is some empirical fact in the world. So even if I can point to data verifying growing wealth disparities, or I can point to physical lands burning and drowning, for these to be crises means they have to be recognized as such. And this point cuts both ways. We can also materialize a reality to argue that we're in a crisis. And moreover, to assert that wealth gaps and climate change are the outcome of the crisis of capitalism is another rhetorical move, one I completely agree with, by the way, but one that can be challenged and has been challenged by alternative explanations, be it what we call human nature or settler colonialism or systemic racism. We should be careful about how outlining such entities and relations informs our understanding of crisis and of capitalism, we should be careful about how outlining those entities and relations informs these understandings or distracts us from what we should be paying attention to. It appears thus that any realization of crisis involves three temporal moves. So first, identifying a crisis, that is the recognition of crisis. Two, identifying its causes, that is the recognition of what produced a crisis. And three is identifying its effects, that is the recognition of what the crisis produces. So inevitably, we are never talking about a crisis. In any claim that there is a crisis, the causes and effects of that crisis are also often crises themselves. And it is easy to get tangled in this web, right? So is this the crisis? Is what caused the crisis the real crisis? Or is this effect of the crisis the actual crisis? And I've spoken a bit already about identifying a crisis and identifying its causes. So let's, for a minute, focus on the third thing, identifying the effects of crisis, such as the kinds of cascading crises that follow crisis, the management of crisis, the solutions that are offered. What does this one have to do with language? A lot. If one effect of crisis is, as Monica says, quote, the unsettling feeling that taken for granted ways of using language are called into question, then language, of course, becomes the central object up for debate. Calling language into question is often coupled with strategies for how to manage or solve it. For example, as a result of crisis, or as the crisis itself, people often question reality and characterize a social order as false or broken. So, for example, talk about fake news or talk about slavery's afterlives. Linguistic solutions to broken social orders include things like, how do we revise turn-taking norms so that we're sharing the floor? How do we police language so that we say things like undocumented immigrant and not illegal immigrant? How do we create international auxiliary languages like Esperanto to improve global communication or bring about a socialist world order? People often propose such linguistic solutions to social problems, focusing time and energy on changing pejorative terms, debating racist discourse, teaching academic language, and so on, as if that will solve a crisis, and I'm afraid it will not. I end by revisiting Monica's two main assertions. So her first assertion is that capitalism is crisis, and her second assertion is, quote, that language plays such an important role as a terrain of struggle and that it can be used to foment crisis as often as it is used to construct means of navigating and resolving it. And I just want to raise two questions in response to these assertions to lead us into discussion. So my first question is, if we can agree that capitalism is crisis, then why can't we agree that socialism is the solution? And what would language's role be in that project of undoing and reconstituting the political economic order? And then my second question is language in fact important? When is it a distraction? And are we avoiding the crisis of capitalism by focusing on language, and when? So that's it. Thank you.
Now that we have lots of great ideas and material out in the room for discussion via language, I would like to invite our online audience to put your questions into the chat. That is the best way for you to participate in this, and we will articulate your questions here in person for our wonderful people to discuss and dig into. We have two microphones that are here, and what I suggest is you guys give me one, and I will circulate in the audience, and you share the other, and then we can have a conversation about these great ideas. Thank you so much. Oh, we have an extra microphone. Okay. So we do have an extra microphone. I will come up to get it, and maybe you can begin by having a bit of a conversation about your shared ideas as people think about their questions, and then we'll get them circulating. Thank you.
So first, this is working, right? Yeah. Thank you, Auntie, for engaging with what I was trying to say. So I'm not sure I said capitalism is crisis. I think I tried to say that capitalism tends to have cycles which generate crises on a kind of regular basis, because the logic of it is constantly of profit, is constantly having to seek markets, having to seek cheaper sources of labor and raw materials. And so you kind of often get a kind of a disconnect between, oh, we can all get rich this way. We can all have access to resources that this economic process produces. And oops, actually, we really need inequality for this thing to work. So that's the contradiction there that tends to pretty often get out of hand. So the question is, why do we tolerate that disconnect? And we have to believe that it's possible for it to not be the case in order to be able to do that, which is a discursive move. Which is why I think, instead the question is, what is it? What are the shared frames of reference that we have that allow us to continue engaging in these processes on the assumption that stuff's going to get better? This will work itself out somehow. From what we've seen historically, communism has had the same kind of problems, right? It's supposed to work this way. It keeps not working this way. So at what point do you decide, I can't tolerate this anymore. I can't stand it. So I think that's where, I take your point about the importance of recognizing crisis for there to be a crisis. I think it's possible analytically to talk about it even when there's some people involved, like Marie Antoinette, for example. We're like, crisis, what crisis? I'm not going to invest in saying there's a crisis. So I think there is a kind of a second move there, but that's maybe where we get immediately into a discussion of materialism, and I'll just sort of drop it right here.
I think that I read your talk and heard your talk as saying that we could perhaps characterize capitalism itself as crisis. And maybe that's, and you're saying that that's not what you were really saying, in that in fact the things that it can produce, like as you were saying, the wealth disparities and the climate crisis, that those are actually the crises that are occurring, and maybe then capitalism would be the cause or part of the cause of it. But what if capitalism was the crisis? I mean, in a real long, centuries-long ongoing crisis, where it's difficult to talk about it as a kind of bounded event with a start and finish, but the sort of foundation that lurks beneath the structure and kind of bubbles and cracks, to produce further crises. So I guess I'm wondering what it would mean to call a kind of political economic system like capitalism a crisis, because that is a part of what I really enjoyed about your sort of critique and kind of analysis, is just really pointing to capitalist systems as just like the real a real problem. Now, its alternatives, which leads to my first question about, if we do agree that capitalism is the problem, then why aren't we all agreeing that socialism is the solution? Why instead are we so committed? When I say we, I mean kind of the mainstream American political discourse. Why are we so committed to reform and reformist kinds of movements, rather than ones that really kind of tear down and have us rethink what kind of political economy we want to participate in? So that's, for me, I think politically frustrating, is kind of how the sort of, in the US context, for example, the right and left can be quite, even though they are sort of positioned as ideological opposites, they definitely agree, I think, that capitalism is a model they want to stay firmly within, and it can be really frustrating. So it just made me, when I was reading your piece, it made me think, why aren't we more invested in sort of alternative models outside of capitalism as sort of a way out of crises?
I'm not going to touch commentary on the US political situation. I'm not a citizen. It's not legit. But I will say that I think partly maybe, to the extent to which we have any differences at all, It has to do with what I feel I've learned from watching various movements, and the one that I've watched sort of the most closely has been the Francophone minority nationalist movement, which was meant to be emancipatory, was meant to be liberatory, and which just reproduced the same hierarchies that people were struggling against in the first place. So my sense of solutions is that you have to be careful what you wish for, that things are often have unintended and perverse consequences, which is not to say we shouldn't try other things, right? And what I find interesting about is and I do think this is a characteristic, an observable characteristic of this moment and of other moments, is that it's not hegemonic. I mean, you're saying that in the US it is, that may be true. It's not necessarily my sense of other spaces that I've kind of noticed or had a foot in, but that it's a moment precisely when you get emergent, multiple forms of attempts at imagining the world otherwise. Some of them, you and I might look at and go, ooh, not that. And others we might go, oh, that's kind of interesting, let's try that. But no matter what we try, I think there is a danger in saying that's the solution, right? As opposed to saying, let's try that, see if we can make it work in a way we like better, taking on board a recognition of the always existing possibilities of producing stuff we really didn't have in mind in the first place.
Hi, Monica. Hi, Angie. Thank you so much for this exchange. I wonder if I could push us to talk a little bit about the tensions between individuals and institutions that are at the heart of a lot of what you're talking about, I think, right? Because it's really easy for many reasons to act as if solutions are to any particular political problem or crisis are individual, perhaps especially in this historical moment, whereas, institutions have at their heart their own reproduction, right, over time. So I wonder if either of you want to take on the kind of like tensions between how do we think about solutions that engage with those tensions between individuals and institutions?
I think it's a really important question. And one of the things that I was trying to say with that kind of throwaway line about, uneasy alliances always have gaps, right? They always have interstices where you can there's wiggle room. You can work in there to, if you want an institution to fall, I mean, there's dramatic things you can do, but there's also smaller everyday things you can do. And so the question, to my mind, is partly a theoretical one, right, of how we understand the relationship between everyday life and the longer term production and reproduction of institutions. From my perspective, there isn't a distinction between an institution and an interaction. They don't exist on different planes of reality. An institution has to reproduce itself in the everyday life of what is within the discursive space that it delimits. It's kind of how I think about it. So you're constantly having to do some kind of boundary control. The question is, do you just go along with that? Or do you say, nah, I want to mess with this boundary? You can get, kicked out on your ass, absolutely. And you can decide it's too dangerous. There are times when challenging institutions is really dangerous because those institutions tend to have the resources that, they could police in a kind of a literal way. So, the question is, and this is where, I'm going to, sing to the choir about ethnography, that what ethnography does for us is to show us where those gaps are and to show us what the consequences might be of fiddling with them. Ethnography can show us where the boundaries are and what the boundary processes are, and therefore what it might mean, what it might take to mess with them, and what it might do to mess with them. So I think, that's a really important tool that we can use a whole lot more maybe than we have.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I really liked your responses there. I think, looking at institutions is very central, and I think also a really great place to sort of ethnographically explore how crises are understood and managed. And it's in those places where we really see the kind of reformist type of work I'm speaking about, where institutions are often institutions because they can survive and thrive within the present political economic order. And so there is an interest, right, in maintaining that order in order for the institution to survive and for crises to be managed in a way that brings out reforms. I think anthropology is having a crisis. Our corporations, American corporations, are having a crisis. And it's really fascinating to see what kinds of strategies are employed to manage those. And I think that they reveal a lot of what our contemporary ideologies are about what a person is, what living is. So I really like that question.
And I could just add one more thing that occurred to me as you were speaking, Angie, which is that the boundary business means that there's stuff that's produced as garbage, right? That's either dangerous or silenced or it's not there. And so I think one of possibly the hallmarks of crisis is that doesn't hold anymore. The stuff that's shoved under the table, let's say, just won't go under the table anymore, or can't go under the table anymore, or maybe can be invited to emerge from the table. But that's another source of thinking about, how does change happen?
I'm looking around to see if there are other questions in the audience.
As soon as you turned around, I lowered my hand. Hi, thank you. This has been really, really interesting. My question is more on the individual side of what we were just talking about with the individuals and the institutions. I know that this is like an academic space right now, but if you're thinking about individuals who may not be anthro people, it can seem really like there's nothing that can be done to challenge these or to address these crises that we're facing. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts. You alluded to these gaps that we're seeing. Like if you had any thoughts, both of you, if it should be more of a language thing, and or if it should be language and economic change and political change. Like if you had more thoughts on how individuals outside academia might try to think about like hopeful things that they could do.
I'm sort of a cynical, non-hope lady, but I think part of what I was trying to say is not that it's all language, but rather that it's all actually the same thing, right? So it all gets connected. You kind of, I don't know, you stick a fork in this side and it comes out the other side. And at some level, so I'm not sure in the long run it matters which thread you pull, to use another metaphor. Pull the thread that's closest to you. Pull the thread that you can thread. We're not positioned in the same ways, precisely. So, I can, maybe pull an anthro thread, although I'm not even sure how legitimate I am to do that. But you could probably pull a different thread, right? And that I think I think what I'm trying to say is that we kind of need to take a kind of a step back and say, where am I with respect to this? What are the threads that are close to me? And I suppose also, you know, you pull the thread, you kind of have to see what happens, because it might not unravel exactly in the way you had in mind.
Okay, I'll just answer, and then Ignacy. Yeah, that's a great question. It made me think about how we need to think about language in at least two ways. One is what language has to do with the sort of constitution of reality, or what we regard to be sort of happening or real in the world. And like I said, I think this is why I really like linguistic anthropology, because I think we're really positioned well to sort of interrogate that and to really tease out these sort of taken for granted kinds of systems, to kind of really figure out how they're built. So that's one, I think, hopeful thing I can say is I'm glad you are being trained in linguistic anthropology to help do that work with all of us. The other thing about language is that not only is it kind of the means to sort of build a reality, it also gets positioned as kind of as like an object of, as a problem to be fixed, or actually the thing that's going to fix a problem. And I often think about, why is that? Why are people looking at language and getting all concerned about what what language can do or what it can't do? And I don't have an answer to that, but I'm curious about that. Why the things we're pointing out. Like why do we all get entangled in these sort of language policing sort of controversies, and paying paying attention to language and trying to solve problems with language. So those are kind of two hopeful things, just like two directions or ways to think about language and its role here, for help to kind of untangle the kinds of messes that get created or that we want to undo.
So we have 3 questions that have come in online, and so I'm going to read them from here, and we'll just take them one at a time. Our first question is actually for Angela. Someone asks, why do you assume that there are only 2 alternatives, capitalism and socialism?
Well, I think there are several possible ways to structure political economic systems. I guess capitalism and socialism are 2 prominent ones in my mind. Communism, of course, is another, and they get defined in all different kinds of ways. Anarchism, I think, is another important one to consider. So I guess I don't really see it just as like an either-or choice, but I do take your point, if this is part of it, is that like I am building on the assumption that capitalism has an opposite, and that opposite would be socialism. Or maybe I'm saying that capitalism has a fierce rival, and that its most fierce rival is socialism. So that's how I would respond to that.
Great. Monica, would you like to respond to this too, or anyone else from our in-person audience?
No, I mean, all I would say is that we, have institutionalized some economic arrangements, and we've given them names, but those are only the ones we've cooked up so far, and we can cook up other ones and give them names or not. I mean, but that's part of the issue here, and this is we come back to language, right? Is So do we understand these things in the same way? When you say capitalism and I say capitalism, when you say socialism, are we talking about the same thing? And so, you can also, you can use non-linguistic modes of, fomenting social change, but then people are going to sit down and say, well, what did that mean? Why did she do that? So we get back to the same place all the time, I think, in that respect.
Great. Okay, a second question from online is for Professor Heller. Could you say more about the Francophone movements and how they led to outcomes that were not anticipated?
Well, yes, I'm not sure they were entirely unanticipated. I don't think they were anticipated by everybody, let's put it that way. So the legitimizing discourse, to kind of put it in overly simple terms, and my political scientist partner is sitting there and is going to be like, no, that's not what happened, is that, so the Canadian political economic system is essentially, settler colonialism and an resource extraction mode. French did that, then they lost it, they actually traded it for Martinique, Guadeloupe, both of them, with the Brits, and so it's kind of this double settler colonialism. And so Canada has always used ethno-national, ethno-linguistic difference. Indigenous people, French people called different names at different points historically, Anglo-ish people, as ways of legitimating a particular hierarchy in the organization of resource extraction, in which initially in the fur trade, indigenous people were the producers of furs, Francophones were how you got them out of the forest, and the Anglophones were the ones who shipped them and made a profit off of them. And so in that sense, the Canadian social hierarchy has always been kind of culturalized, or legitimated through culturalization of the kind of the usual discourse around minorities, not having a head for doing capitalism in this particular case. So Francophones historically were, lovely people, great singers, really good at dancing, lots of fun, but no head for business. And this is sort of the legitimizing discourse for why it is that Francophones were first placed, lower down in the hierarchy in the fur trade, in fishing, in all of the other resource extraction, in lumber, in mining, and then eventually as industrial labor in the 19th century. And so the notion was that if you're a Francophone, you can't have access to the fundamental wealth that this country produces, or this colony in this country produces, because of the cultural nature of who you are. And there's a boundary there between Francophone and Anglophone that was really hard to cross, and which was racialized as well. And so at some point there was a realization that if we use the affordances of liberal democracy to mobilize this group that got produced as an ethnocultural minority in this way, in my account, as an ethno-class, then we can sort of pierce, we can get into the sources of wealth as a collective. And so it required collective mobilization to mobilize votes, also by carving off the population in ways which needed to make a distinction between Québécois and all the other people who were formerly French-Canadian. And therefore, in my lifetime, I saw the invention of Franco-Ontarians and Franco-Manitobains and Franc-Saskois, which didn't exist before 1970 something. So that promise was that all of us, as long as you count as a Francophone and act and perform Francophoneness in some way, we can all have access to this. We'll move up together, and it will be open to all of us. Except that wasn't true, and that couldn't happen because the fundamental system still requires inequality. But being able to see with your own eyes and see in your own family an entire generation of people gain access to forms of decent living that were inaccessible before is highly motivating and solidarity making. But it produced the same kinds of inequalities, and the struggle today, and which we saw just a couple of weeks ago in the last elections in Quebec was the necessity of producing others that are also culturalized as others and whose legitimate access to the resources of the state, Quebec in this particular case, is contested by the state itself in ways that are deeply problematic. So that wasn't what was supposed to happen, right? This was supposed to be an opening up, that all you needed to do was to learn French and you'd be able to be part of that. But that's not what actually, so some people did profit, absolutely. But the notion that it would be, an all of something called us was not. Was it intended or unintended? I think for some people it was unintended. Other people, I think, didn't think about it, particularly. I'm not sure, I don't think there was a kind of a cynical end of the mobilization, but the 60s into the early 70s was a moment where there were actually alternative views of what this should look like, including more radical socialist views with people who used the model of socialist revolution to try to really fundamentally change the political economy of Quebec, and then they were hit under the table because really this was in the interest of an emerging bourgeoisie, which found itself shut out of a political economy which is fundamentally capitalist.
Great, thank you so much. We have one more question from cyberspace, and this one begins with, thank you so much, Professor Heller. A very clear, stimulating, thought-provoking intervention it has been. What might you have to say about the psychosocial dimension of the matter described? For instance, Norbert Elias comes to mind. Thank you.
Why do I think that it's my psychoanalyst cousin who asked that question? It's not... Benny, if that's you. So I think this actually rejoins Gillian's question in some ways, right? In the sense that it's a question of the articulation of how we act as individuals in relation to other people we understand as being similar beings, or other things that we understand as being communicable with, but maybe a little bit different, or totally alien, as the case may be. And in that sense, I think, and I get this from 100 years ago in my training as a graduate student, that the concept of frames of reference, and I can't speak to Elias intelligently right at this moment, the concept of frame of reference is a psychosocial concept. And it's connected to exactly what I understood you to be saying, Angie, about the social construction of reality, right? That this gets concocted somehow in our interaction with each other and interaction with, let's call it the world, for want of a better term. And so in that sense, we can't separate ourselves out of that experience and out of our experiences of learning how to understand it, whether that's through oh God, if I step off the edge of the stage, that's going to hurt. Or somebody telling me that didn't hurt. What are you talking about? That's not. Don't be such a wimp. Right? That's not real pain. So in that, and we can argue about whether there's a psychology inside or whether it's all methodologically outside. But I do think that the fundamental thing here is that it's relational, and that it can't exist otherwise. I'm going to make you cry.
Sure, I'll ask a question. I love this talk, and the conversation has been really terrific. And this is kind of a random question, but I'm thinking about the Esperanto and the sort of moment of crisis and then the focus on language. And that's kind of like, hey, let's build a frame of reference from the ground up. And that actually is a super interesting process. I'm also thinking about something that's happening in this moment, which is cryptocurrency, like kind of critiques of money, right? And again, let's build this from the ground up kind of ideas about how you create and all this talk about governance and so on. And I find these two things interesting, and I also find them kind of scary, in terms of what are the sort of possible unintended consequences or ways in which capitalism, in addition to producing crises, kind of feeds on them, sucks stuff back in, right? So anyway, random, unorganized question, but cryptocurrency?
I mean, in that sense, the big critique of Esperanto, of course, is that it wasn't so ground up. It's really Romance languages with a bit of German, and maybe some Russian tossed in, and with rules that would be familiar from anybody who carried around the grammar of some standard, nation-state language, and so that it wasn't revolutionary enough, really, that it was really just a bourgeois attempt to, make things better somehow. And that's, certainly part of the reason I raise it is that we were trained to, think of it as a stupid, funny thing that you might have in your intro linguistics class. Maybe it's not so stupid and funny, after all, maybe there is really a sincere attempt here to do things otherwise. I found, the Occupy movement's attempt to, there are lots of ways in which you can run a really big meeting in an open space. Hitler had some ideas around that. So did Stalin. But, we could do it differently. So how do we have these spaces that are, and here I think also it's an important question around institutions and individuals. How do you inscribe more people into the same discursive space? Habermas thought you could just, do it and make it democratic and it would be fine. And I'm like, man, I'm not sure that people aren't going to fight over who's going to control the space. We have to keep a watch on that. And, I haven't participated enough in Occupy movements to know, did that really work, right? Or was it easier for some people to gain the floor, and were some people's words transmitted more than other people's words? I think, trying to invent things otherwise is always risky because you don't know, right, how it's going to end up. On the other hand, and you can say, I'd rather live with the poison I know, than invent some new poison. On the other hand, I think I'm going to use the word hope. One of my hopes is that we can learn to keep track of, it's like what I was saying to you earlier. I'm going to pull this thread. I'm not going to turn away and just, see, what's going to happen, but actually follow it, and follow it in a principled way according to, there's some reason, there's some value, there's some moral order that we're after. I'd be interested to talk about what the moral order of cryptocurrency is. I think we should maybe talk about that. But I think, the link between the moral order and the social order is really key here. And then the question is, how do we make that happen, and how do we kind of pull back when we see it kind of, going off the edge and down the cliff?
I just want to say I love that question, and I hadn't thought about cryptocurrency in Esperanto, for example, in the same sentence, but it's amazing, because I think that's so true. It's about they have very similar kinds of things. So if Esperanto is sort of an answer to these multiple languages that are often bounded by certain kinds of nation-state boundaries or whatever, and this sort of desire to build kind of a universal system that is available to all and can cross those borders. So too does cryptocurrency, right? We have so many different forms of money, and then we're building something from the ground up so that it also has a universal access. There are linguistic anthropologists who are looking at that, like Asavaga is written about it, and my student Ezra Padgett is writing about cryptocurrency, and in fact she's really interested in the question of moral economy, and she's drawing into conversation cryptocurrency and the adult industry, and how there are all of these really fascinating kinds of ties and alliances being built. So look out for her work. But I love thinking about that. And now I'm going through my head thinking, well, so we're talking about language, we're talking about money, what other kinds of
We're talking about the free software movement.
Softwares. I was going to raise that actually, that Linux kept coming to mind as you guys were talking, right? The coding world where actually, in some ways it might, I mean, I don't know, I would propose it might be an even closer parallel because cryptocurrency is predicated on huge inputs of energy, which come from capitalist-oriented systems. And so it seems like it's very level and flowy, but actually it reinforces in a very deeply pernicious way inequalities based on how energy is distributed across landscape. But Linux is really interesting because it's a coding language, and sort of hackathons and the ways that people use non-standard digital languages to do this kind of free flow, non-hierarchical exchange of information is really interesting too.
You know, there is a huge overlap in the world in terms of who's doing it, in the world of constructed languages and the world, you know, the coding world. It's deeply masculine. Mm-hmm. So, you know, there's that. And again, you know, so my sense is most of these attempts to imagine the world otherwise end up having some exclusions that we need to attend to. And the reasons for those exclusions in particular, right, I think are worth attending to.
Other questions from the audience? And we have 3 more online. This is a great conversation. Let me pass it back to you first. Thanks.
I wanted to say, while we're getting to Ignacy, like, could pedagogy be another thing that is imagining otherwise right now? I feel like they're different.
Yeah, the question, I mean, you know, as someone who has spent decades in a faculty of education, it has to engage in what Bourdieu calls the role of education in social reproduction. And so there are limits to pedagogy which most faculties of education prefer not to attend to.
I don't know if I can formulate a question well, but the thing that keeps bugging me is why are we talking about crisis now and not in the 70s or in the 80s or the 90s, where you were talking about change. There's always been change. Capitalism, to some degree, is like some old man that it's dying all the time but never dies. It just keeps there and there and there. So is it crisis because is it a scale issue that is affecting more people? Is it crisis because it's affecting us, middle class, and not developing global south, people who have been in crisis for hundreds of years because we were exploiting them and just extracting resources. So for them, they've been in crisis for a much longer time. So why? And it's interesting that it's not because the series of talks is called Crisis. Everywhere you turn, people are feeling crisis. Is it because change is happening so much faster? And people are just puzzled that they cannot take anything for granted because in 5 minutes, there's something else. Is it because what you were saying before of the garbage, that the garbage doesn't want to stay under the rug? So I don't think there's an answer, but what are the factors that are making that now we think about crisis more, perhaps, us than years ago?
I'm not going to be able to answer that whole question, but I think you raised some interesting and important points. So one of them, I think, and this is why, you know, I was asked to give a talk, and I said, think about this. So what do I think crisis is? And I don't think crisis is just difficulty in making a life. I think crisis is the sense we make out of why we do things coming unstuck. Things might work really badly for me, but I have an account for why that is. And when I can no longer have an account, that's the crisis. It's supposed to do this, and it's not doing this, and I don't know why it's not doing this. And so what am I supposed to believe anymore? So I think for me that's, at the moment, you know, talk to me in 2 weeks, I might feel differently, but is the key issue for why we're talking about it now. It's that unstuckness. The analysis of how it came to pass, you know, is really important, and I can't give you a nicely, you know, wrapped package for that. But I think that, for me, that's the key issue here.
Just to say, I love that question, and I think that I think in your question is the assumption that we are talking about crisis now, but we haven't talked about it before, and I actually don't know if that's the case. It might be. I haven't looked into it, and again, this would be a great like linguistic anthropological project to kind of trace historically. I guess we could look at the word crisis and see how it's been used in different moments, or maybe what we regard to be crisis now had a different name. But certainly, I would think that we've had some kind of notion of crisis before this moment, and that you just opened up a really great area of inquiry to kind of think about the sort of historical processes at play that have led to this current moment. Yeah.
But I think there's also, I mean, again, it's an empirical question, but I think it's also important, I think you're absolutely right, that there probably have been times and places where there has been a crisis for people who've been sitting there going, crisis, right? And everybody else is just going, crisis, crisis, one crisis.
Great. We have 3 questions from online, and it's 8 o'clock, so mindful of everyone's time, I suggest that we take these 3 questions and we give a moment to see if there are any final words of wrap-up from the floor. Does that sound like an okay plan for everyone? Okay. The first of the last questions. Thank you, Monica and Angela. With admiration, I was wondering how the framework of mix, excess, and fake in relation to post-colonial elites could be used as a discursive tool to engage in a type of cognitive dissonance or recalibration, to expose the precarity embedded in the positions and get people to think otherwise or to make change happen. I can reread it. Should I read it again? Should I read them all? Sure. Okay. The second question starts with a comment. The whole idea is to find something new. Human cultures have provided evidence of many other economic forms throughout history. I think that's a comment on the earlier conversation about capitalism and socialism. And finally, and this directly addresses politics, so I put that out there because I know maybe Professor Heller doesn't want to engage in US politics. And I laughed because I thought, oh, that's a very wise thing. What language would you use to describe the crisis in anthropology? Can you discuss the US elephant in the room, Trumpism, and any connection to fascism, which many consider threatening democracy, and those all have scare quotes around them, once again throughout the world?
Well, on that last one, I can talk about fascism in Canada. We're not immune by any stretch of the imagination. And I think, also because we're as inscribed as anybody else in the West, in the issues, in the problems of liberal democracy and in the non-delivery of access to resources that liberal democracy is performing at the moment. And so, we're Hungary, Sweden, the US, Canada, we all have those, we all have those movements. And for those of you thinking that immigrating to Canada will be a solution to your problem, it might not be. So I don't think we're different in that sense. We do tend to want to believe that the Francophone world and the Anglophone world and the Indigenous world are really different. I think we don't attend enough to the imbrications for that. But there was a reason why I talked about Victor Klemperer and evoked that particular moment of crisis, which is deeply reminiscent of some of the things that we're experiencing now. And so I think that one of the ways in which people seek to solve the problem of the delegitimization of the state is to say, fine, we need a strong leader who will lead us out of this morass, and you can call it whatever you want, It could be a religious movement. It could be a fascist movement. We've inherited materials to work with, none of which are reimaginings. I think they're just recycling the same kinds of tensions that we have lived through before. My mother did talk about Trump at the end of her life. She was 92 and she died a couple of years ago. She said, "I started my life with Hitler and I'm ending it with Trump, not much progress." So she was working in cycles, not in linear time. And that's, I just want to leave that out there as something to think with. With respect to the first question, I'm not sure I understand mix. And I would have to talk to that person who asked the question, but I think this is something that Angie and I have talked about as being kind of unhelpful insofar as it assumes the reality of things that get mixed. Your gaze is still on the stuff that we already invented and then say, oh, they're touching and that's going to mess things up. And I won't speak for you, but I think we feel that that's still playing the game by the same rules, just disturbing it a little bit, as opposed to saying, no, there's another way of understanding these phenomena completely. And certainly on the terrain of language, we've been arguing about this for a long time. And in some ways, I think with my co-author Bonnie McElhenney, we came to the conclusion that the central problem here is the extraction of this thing called language from bodies, individual and social, and that it's not until we put it back that we can start to think differently.
Okay, great. Do we have any final comments from the audience that's here? This was a wonderful summation, actually, I think, of many themes that we talked about this evening. Thank you to everyone for coming to our first in-person session. It was very lovely to have everyone back together again and to have it all flow so beautifully together. Thank you to our online audience for joining us. Thank you, Professor Heller, for coming all the way from Canada. Thank you, Angie, for coming to join us here in New York City. And our next talk, which will be up on the slide in a few minutes as we leave the room, will be of our next event, which will happen on November 28th. It will be a talk on archaeology, again, dealing with the theme of crisis, whether invented or otherwise, historically deep or current. This is indeed the theme of our year this year. If you have not yet signed in, we do have a sign-up sheet, and we'd love to take your name down and your email address, and we'll keep you informed of our upcoming talks. And for now, I think we could join our hands together and thank our wonderful presenters for this evening. Thank you so much.